Hello everyone, this is part 55 of What If Naruto Passed the Genin test, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. You'll be begging me to KU, Naruto rasped, his voice threatening to give out and his breathing labored. Just as soon as I get loose I'm going to. He stopped short as the blue ribbons of energy flitted from the tips of Madara's fingers and ran over the Uzumaki's body. Naruto's back arched against the leather straps holding him to the table and he opened his mouth to scream. No sound escaped him. Madara sighed, seemingly disinterested. I don't see why you're so stubborn, said the ancient Uchiha. I'm offering you power beyond your comprehension, glory that will last for eternity, a world without any war or plague or evil. All you have to do is consent to being my mind-bound servant. Madara paused and the blue ribbons of light jumped back to his hand and Naruto's form crumpled. Go, Naruto gasped, de-sping with sweat, go to hell. I'm not helping you. Madara sighed again and the blue energy jumped from his fingers back onto Naruto, racing around his form like vipers dashing after prey, coiling around his limbs as Naruto again strained and silently cried out. So stubborn, said Madara calmly. I'm not too worried though. Eventually, after you undergo and witness enough you will give in. He looked around the small chamber. I really should get some furniture in here if you're going to make the process lengthier than it has to be. Madara let the T-ribbons do their worst for the next few minutes, until Naruto's face and outermost extremities began to turn violet from lack of air, then called them back to his hand again where they swirled in his palm and cast their seemingly innocuous glow throughout the otherwise unlit room. Come on, Madara said when it became apparent that Naruto was too exhausted to put up any kind of verbal struggle. Being mind-bound isn't really so bad. You'll retain all of your faculties, all of your creativity, you just won't be able to disobey me. It's not like the process of binding even hurts, it's like a tickle in the front of your head. If it's so simple then why do you need me to consent? Naruto asked, turning to look at Madara's one visible eye. The Uzumaki's beleaguered tone might have been mocking if it wasn't so pained. The concept is simple, but it requires a great deal of concentration, said Madara nonchalantly. Unlike those silly seals Orochimaru was so fond of, mind binding is both absolute and inescapable. It's also tricky though, and resistance makes it impossible even for me. Too bad, said the blonde. I'm not helping you. You will, said Madara, closing his hand and extinguishing the ribbons, blackening the room instantly. After a moment of dark the door to the room opened and allowed the light of the hall to enter. Madara stepped from the room and glanced back at Naruto. By week's end it will be Haruno Sakura UCTD on your account. We'll see how much of that it takes. The door closed and again Naruto was locked into total blackness. He let his head rest against the cool surface of the steel table and exhaled deeply. Even now the ribbons Madara had become so fond of using to tee him seemed to burn across his skin, though to an infinitely lesser degree. Naruto would have grinned provided he had the energy when he felt a familiar presence seeping into his consciousness. Kit? Asked Kyuubi as if to make sure Naruto was still there. Uchiha must have left. He's gone, Naruto responded, pausing briefly. Have you come up with a theory on how he can push you back into your cage? Not as of yet, said Kyuubi. It should be impossible. No spirit, not a demon's, not even a Shinigami's, should be able to push my consciousness out of yours. Just like it should be impossible for him to use any chakra-based techniques in this room with that seal on the ceiling. Naruto let his eyes linger on the spot on the ceiling where the intricate rune was etched. He could barely make it out in the black, like a shadow within the shadows, since when it wasn't absorbing chakra it was all but invisible. He felt Kyuubi's affirmation. There are many mysteries about that man. But he is just a man, thought Naruto. And men, no matter how powerful they are, can be ked. Naruto's thoughts turned inward so that even the Kyuubi couldn't hear them. And I will K him for everything he's done to me and the people I care about. At least I can shield you from the residual pain when he leaves, Kyuubi went on. Naruto was very thankful for that fact. But I'm not sure what either of us can do should he make good on his promise to capture the vixen and make you watch as he. Kyuubi felt Naruto's mood sour further and trailed off. I'll think of a way to get us out of here before then. Naruto nodded once in the dark. We'll manage, Naruto told both his demonic partner and himself, though for the first time in a long time, the genuine fear of total defeat was beginning to eat at his resolve. We have to. SC. Elsewhere in the Rain Village's citadel, a shape less than a shadow, indeed barely a flicker of distorted space, moved through the study Madara had claimed as his own. The flicker of a shape glided silently to the desk still strewn with piles of scrolls and books, and hovered there. What am I even looking for? Itachi wondered as he let his incorporeal hands glide over the covers of the books and the rolls of paper. As his fingers floated into contact with the various tomes, a fraction of the knowledge within was transferred to Itachi's consciousness, giving his disembossed spirit a feel for what the volume was about. He stood there for several moments, sorting through the flood of seemingly useless snippets of information lancing into his mind. I'd expected more on jutsus and the like, he allowed himself to muse, knowing that in this form he was completely incapable of setting off one of the many wards or alarms he was sure Madara had installed in the study to guard it against intruders. All that's here are rambling journals and old. He stopped as a bolt of cold shot through his mind. It had come the instant he'd touched a book near the bottom of the pile at the very back end of the desk. He'd received no information from the tome, but a pang of horror made the book impossible to miss. What could this be? On the other side of the tower, laying in a comfortable bed, Itachi's seemingly sleeping body squinted as his spirit in Madara's study drove its hands deep into the large tome to divine whatever was contained within its pages. For more than a minute Itachi's face grew gradually harder and more perplexed as though he was falling deeper into a restless sleep, until his eyes snapped open and his spirit catapulted back into his body. The Uchiha's breath caught and he jolted up in his bed from the sudden mental shock. His hand went to his head and he began breathing deeply. For several long minutes he sat in absolute silence, barely even drawing breath. Impossible, he muttered at last. That's impossible. Itachi swung his legs over the edge of his bed and looked blankly about his unremarkable little room buried in an out-of-the-way corner of the citadel as his mind processed what his spirit had learned. The candle burning in the corner reflected off his black eyes as he turned to look at it with a hollow expression. Everything. He asked himself. Absolutely everything. How is that even possible? Itachi took a stee's breath. He knew it should be impossible. He should dismiss it as lunacy, as insanity, but at the same time, somehow he knew it was possible. He'd seen it all laid out, step by terrifying step in the book, and he knew that if anyone was capable of such a thing, it was Madara. But to unmake the entire. He trailed off and sat again silently for the better part of half an hour more. His eyes flitted back and forth between the door of the windowless room and the lamp in the corner as his thoughts turned over and over. Itachi got to his feet and put on his cloak. Now it all makes at least a little more sense, all his inconsistencies and secret agendas, he thought as he slipped his hat on his head. He must be stopped, but how? King Naruto wouldn't be enough, helping him escape would delay Madara's plan but wouldn't stop it. Destroying the statue would only slow things down. Itachi silenced his thoughts as he left the room and began walking quickly down one of the citadel's hallways, realizing that allowing himself to panic was a poor substitute for actually working to come up with a solution. I need a way to deal with Madara's plans directly, thought the Uchiha as he came to the door of the old library and passed inside. And a simple death match with him would probably just get me killed unless I caught him completely unaware, which is impossible with that damned immortal Sharingan. I need people to help me and the only ones capable want me. Sir again. Itachi had to consciously quieted his thoughts as they began to race faster and faster, bordering on panic. Easy, he warned himself, trying to regain his composure. He paused and looked around the library at the mountains of books and scrolls it contained, most of which were older than anyone alive in the world today, with the exception of Madara. Maybe there's something here. I have a little time to prepare at least. SC. Only a handful of people had slept the night before, and Sasuke had not been one of them. Most of the ninja had been running patrols around the columns of army troops as the coalition's forces made their way through the night towards Iwa, and the young Uchiha was no exception. He took some solace in the knowledge that Kurena was one of the fortunate few who had been able to rest in one of the many covered carriages that the army kept in tow. Now though, as he looked out over the open land between his army and the village of Iwa, from the perimeter of which plumes of smoke were already pouring into the air, his limbs felt especially heavy. At least the fight isn't over quite yet, he said to himself, though to his right a huge, burly man in a scuffed but well-made suit of full-plate armor nodded. And the fight won't be over until every last soldier in this army is said the soldier in a grating voice. We'll fight for the win to the death, every one of us. Sasuke couldn't prevent himself from scoffing mentally. He hoped that it didn't show on his face. I think we can work for a better ending than that. The burly legionary snorted then spat in the dirt. That's the plan, Captain. Sakura appeared at Sasuke's side in a whirl of leaves and caught her breath. The crane hasn't broken through the defenders yet, reported the kunoichi, straightening up. She traded her red dress for a jumpsuit made of black material reinforced with boiled leather at the elbows and knees. So there's some good news at least. Sasuke nodded and looked to his right and then to his left. Already battle formations had been drawn up and the coalition's relieving army was beginning the march towards the city from the south. Sasuke's hawk-like eyes noted the bulk of the crane's forces were attacking Iwa from the northeast, but the entire army was now shifting south so to better receive the inevitable counterattack while maintaining its assault. You be careful out there, Sasuke said, turning to Sakura as the ranks of men passed by them, the late morning sun glinting off armor, shields, swords, and spearheads. The soldiers knew that their job was to interfere with the ninja as little as possible until victory was certain one way or the other. There's no guarantee this isn't a trap and I don't want you getting caught between your targets and enemy forces. Sakura smiled and hugged Sasuke, a gesture he quickly returned. I'll be fine, she said, letting go of him. It's you I'm worried about. You and your men really have your work cut out for you. I like it like this, Sasuke made himself grin. I'll be the first one to slam into the enemy, show them who they've pissed off. Good luck, Sakura chirped, disappearing into ranks of troops and leaving Sasuke on his own. The Uchiha sighed and turned his attention on the army. Sprinting forward he quickly positioned himself at the head of the formation. To him, it felt completely wrong not to be sneaking up on the enemy, and even worse not to be dashing towards the lines of enemy soldiers that he could see taking up defensive formations less than 2,000 meters away. He wanted to run forward and it seemed that he was chained to the enspering weight of the sluggish army marching at his back and the next minute rolled by with intolerable slowness. Not good, Sasuke murmured, seeing across the field that archers, hundreds of them had stepped out from the front lines of the enemy army and lifted their bows. Incoming volley, Sasuke shouted, amplifying his voice with chakra so it could be heard like thunder. Shields, he bellowed. Immediately the two calls were echoed throughout the army by ninja and soldiers alike. Sasuke watched as on his side of the field everyone with a shield lifted it skyward and the opposing archers knocked their arrows and drew back the strings. With a metallic grating, like the sliding of great storefront shutters, the ranks of heavy infantry all around Sasuke closed ranks, and interlocked their large tower shields over their heads, still marching forward. Behind the Uchiha the more lightly armed troops raised their kite shields and followed behind the heavy troops. As the crane bowmen released their arrows the air filled with a whining thrum as what looked like hundreds of insects rose up from their ranks, arched into the sky, and began a screaming descent down towards the coalition forces. Just before the first arrow fell, Sasuke ducked back into the ranks of soldiers and took shelter behind a particularly large infantryman's shield. A second later a great clattering erupted all around him as the arrows fell like rain. In the distance he heard a commander of the opposing forces shout, "Fire at will," and then heard the command echoed by other officers. A loud scream behind Sasuke and to his right marked the first arrow finding a FY mark. He turned and saw one of the men with a kite shield had been LD through his thigh and collapsed to the ground. His screaming was silenced an instant later when another shaft punched into his T. Quickly more screams rose from the coalition forces, but many fewer than Sasuke anticipated, and as an explosion thundered not far away he peeked out from between two of the legionaries' shields. He smiled when he saw that the enemy ranks of archers, now less than half a kilometer away, had been thrown into chaos as a fireball the size of a house and seemingly as solid as a boulder rumbled into their midst from nowhere and exploded into a blaze that left dozens and many more charred beyond service or completely shell-shocked. He guessed that had been Sakura's doing. When the last of the arrows fell and clattered harmlessly off a steel shield, Sasuke ducked back into the front of the ranks and the many hundreds of infantrymen stepped out of the defensive formations. So close now that an average soldier could make out the crane's armor being worn by the enemy, Sasuke gave the order for all the soldiers under his command to charge. Quickly he glanced about, catching sight of the wind daimyo off within his own ranks, and most of the other leaders of the coalition also shouting for their troops to attack. Sasuke spun on his heel as the men around him, the light infantry charging ahead of their heavier counterparts as they'd been trained to do, bolted forward. This is more like it, Sasuke grinned, adrenaline beginning to burn in his veins as he charged forward with his men, activating his Mangekyo Sharingan and watching the enemy ranks close. Those in the front braced against their shields while the men behind them lowered spears and pikes. Show them hell. Sasuke leapt into the air, throwing his hands together in a quick series of seals. He took in a deep breath and put his hands behind his back. He bellowed like a lion and ripples of clear energy tore through the air before him and slammed into the enemy lines. Shields painted with the crane's black and red motif cracked and a dozen men fell, every bone in their boss reduced to splinters as around them comrades fell to the ground, dropping their spears and clutching at their bleeding ears. Sasuke's unit was the first to crash into the enemy lines, and immediately the crane's formations buckled, threatening to break on the spot. SC. Are we winning? Sakura blinked, watching with something akin to astonishment the battle unfolding before her. The leader from the bird country, Shirai, shook her head once. Crouching atop the battlements of a tower in Iwa's wall which had been rendered useless by artillery, Sakura and Shirai knew it was unlikely they'd be noticed by the crane troops below, leaving them free to scan for the generals in charge of the army. In the sea of red and black armor, however, Shirai doubted very much that a cloak dyed black with red accents would be easy to spot, even by a ninja of her caliber. We have the tactical advantage, said the older woman, readjusting her brown, down-lined cloak. But we're still outnumbered. Unless we can root out the brains of the bunch, this battle could go either way. Sakura continued to scan the army beneath her as she spoke. At least we still have Iwa's defenders pressing at the crane from the village. That's got to count for something. And that fireball you shot into the enemy archers' lines shook their morale. I never would have thought you were a kunoichi until you told the assembly this morning. That's why we have the tactical advantage, Shirai mumbled as she turned her attention on the battle, ignoring Sakura's comment about being a kunoichi. She watched for a moment and grinned. Although, if that young captain keeps fighting like that, she nodded towards Sasuke just as he drove his stiffened fingers through the faceplate of an armored soldier in crane armor, then flowed into a death blow against an enemy he had staggered with a hard blow a moment earlier. We might have a chance after all. Sakura grinned with pride as she took a second to watch Sasuke. As Shirai stood though, Sakura turned her attention back on the kunoichi. This is taking too long, said Shirai, running through a complex series of seals and chanting under her breath to focus her thoughts on the jutsu. She pointed one hand down at the crane troops beneath her and muttered the last word of her phrase, and the tips of her fingers glowed a brilliant sapphire blue. Bolts of light blasted from her fingers and shot into the lines beneath, spinning through armor with whining shrieks of deforming metal and punching holes as wide as chopsticks straight through men's chests and heads. Think this will flush the ninja out. Before any of the troops below could look up to see what was going on, another volley of a dozen lances of blue light shot from Shirai's fingers and cut short the lives of nearly an entire defensive formation. Shirai stood for a moment as cries of alarm went up among the troops in the center of the crane's army, men who obviously hadn't expected such a direct attack. Where the hell are they? Asked Shirai, watching for the generals as on another tower, Gaara stood up and began flinging various jutsus into the enemies. On the farthest tower from the action, Karena and Trina both revealed themselves and attacked with fiery projectiles and bursts of chakra-fueled light that scorched and terrified the crane troops. Sakura noted that Shikamaru remained concealed. Gaara leapt into the air, landing on the cloud of sand that appeared beneath his feet as the tower just behind him spled with energy, glowing white-hot just before collapsing in on itself like magma. Shirai traced the energy flow to a single point in the crane formation and sure enough, there were two figures in black robes decorated with red clouds. Gotcha, she muttered as all of the coalition's ninja focused their attention on the Akatsuki ninja, a woman, and a man with black tentacles protruding from the sleeves of his cloak. Sakura wondered to herself how she had missed the tentacles before. It doesn't matter, thought the pink-haired Kunoichi as the two ninja on the ground began leaping away from the wall towards the edges of the army to prevent as much damage to the Crane forces as possible in the inevitable battle. We've got the bastards now. She and Shirai, tailing Gaara and followed by the sisters, sprang after their targets, sowing havoc in the ranks of the Crane as they went. As Kakuzu reached the edge of the army and the empty field beyond, he turned to Conan, who kept right behind him. Conan glanced between Hidden and the closing ninja. Hidden? She asked. Kakuzu nodded once and refocused his attention on Gaara, and jumped away with Conan to put more distance between themselves and their enemies. Sakura winced in pain as something caught her ankle and cut her skin. A quick glance revealed that a small hooked shuriken had nicked her ankle. No problem, she thought. It's just a misplaced attack from the front lines. She pushed it from her mind and watched as Gaara stopped a dozen meters away from the two Akatsuki ninja and hovered on a cloud of sand. The Kazekage lifted one hand and the ground beneath him split and shattered into a fine cloud of dust that settled beneath his hanging cloud. Apparently even it was packed earth contained enough sandy substances for Gaara to make use of. The Kazekage also twitched and Sakura saw the same manner of kunai that had cut her ankle flying away from Gaara. She pushed it out of her mind that Gaara's wall of sand should be impenetrable and focused on the fight. From his comparatively safe perch, a tower set in Iwa's wall which overlooked all of the battle unfolding below, Shikamaru and Ino sat silently, both observing every detail of the unfolding battle and scrutinizing every movement made by every party involved. The platinum-haired Kunoichi kept a special eye on the battle between the ninjas on the borders of the Crane's army, waiting just in case she might be called upon for backup. Shikamaru elected to pay more attention to the larger battle between the armies. Thanks again for letting me be a part of this, Ino said quietly. It's easier to keep an eye on you this way, said Shikamaru. Plus we don't have the resources to keep you under house arrest. Ino rolled her eyes. I'll just think of this as parole then. She ignored her teammate's sarcastic tone. As she turned back to the fight, she was just in time to see Gaara make his first concerted attack. A broad sweeping maneuver with a wall of sand meant to flank the two Akatsuki ninja while Sakura and the bird leader attacked from the opposing flank. The woman in the black and red cloak vanished in a cloud of whirling paper and the man simply stood still as though he were going to take the attack head on. As the wall of sand should have buried the ninja, however, black tentacles exploded out of his cloak and seemed to tear him to shreds. Ino watched as the ninja broke apart into dozens of writhing black tentacles, each completely independent of all the others, and scattered like a spilled jar of worms. His name is Kakuzu, said Shikamaru as the tentacle ninja reformed safely out of the way and the paper woman materialized on Gaara's flank, drawn sword in hand. He's a particularly dangerous ninja according to our intelligence. Those appendages of his are all coated in sly neurotoxins and he specializes in launching surprise attacks with them. The woman is named Conan and is less dangerous. Shikamaru paused as Conan whirled into paper when Gaara blacked her sword attack with sand. The pages rushed in at the Kazekage, slapping against the sand which rushed up to protect him and forming a shell in Gaara's rough image before the sand exploded outwards, shredding the paper. But she's not to be trifled with. It looks like we're winning both fights, don't you think? Said Ino, looking between the larger battle, where Sasuke's forces had just broken through the Crane's lines and begun seeing the rear ranks, and the ninja fight where Sakura and Shirai had joined the fray. We've got 'em all on the defensive. Shikamaru didn't answer. It did seem to be going well. Sakura spun on her heel, clenching her fist as blue chakra leapt from between her fingers, fueling her muscles with raw power, and slammed the paper image of Conan square in the T. The clone shattered like papier-mâché and the hollow head toppled to the ground as the body broke into dozens of pieces. Acting on instinct, she dropped down as a black tentacle lanced overhead, passing through the space her face had occupied a second earlier. I can't dodge, she realized too late as another tentacle erupted from the ground at her feet and coiled around her leg. Instantly the Kunoichi filled with a cold illness. She would have vomited if the energy remained, but all her strength vanished as the black poison pumped through her skin into her blood. Sweat broke out onto her forehead and face as she dropped to her knees, looking for help. Gaara and Shirai were both busy handling Conan and Kurena was nowhere to be seen. Black worms bubbled up from the ground before Hira and Kakuzu materialized in their midst. He grinned and reached out for her. A burning bolt of crimson light severed Kakuzu's hand from his wrist and doubled back, cutting loose the tentacle around Sakura's leg. She dropped to her hands and knees as Kakuzu leapt back to avoid the third strike the red energy beam made before vanishing. Naruto? Asked the kunoichi, wondering if the red attack had been Naruto's trademark red chakra. Behind her as Sakura turned she saw Trina. The fiery-haired woman winked at Sakura mischievously as another sphere of energy, this one blue but shifting to red as the kunoichi infused it with a genjutsu, formed in her hand. Thanks, Sakura muttered, feeling her head clear as Kurena rushed past her and Trina leapt to the downed kunoichi's side in defense. Not a problem, said Trina, grinning. Just watch it. I can't always guard your back. Sakura grinned as she struggled to her feet. To her it looked like they were winning. Conan was falling back in the face of a brutal series of attacks from Gaara, while Kurena and Shirai were forcing Kakuzu to slowly give ground. She took a moment to breath and get her bearings. If you surrender now, said Gaara calmly, glaring at Conan, we won't kill you. You'll be given a chance to switch sides after we can. He stopped and spun on his hanging cloud of sand to block with his hand a strike from a paper sword. The floating blade SD through his armor of sandy grit and bit into his hand. Red blood splashed down at Gaara's feet as his little finger and his ring finger were rent from his hand. There the blade stopped though and Gaara motioned with his unwounded hand. Sand raced up from the cloud, enveloped the sword, and tore it into scraps. He turned on Conan, who by now was glistening with sweat, as he ignored the wound. Conan watched and tried to catch her breath as Gaara flicked his hand at the ground, splattering some of the sand with blood. You're out of tricks I think, said Gaara as the blood sank into the sand and turned it a bright red. Then the bleeding, as if Gaara controlled it with sheer will, stopped entirely. Conan leapt to the side to avoid a sudden rush at her position. The sand Gaara had sprinkled with his blood had rushed at her with immeasurable speed and the Kazekage now held his good hand in front of him, making an odd seal with his fingers and whispering to himself. The bloody sand, before a shapeless attack, warped in on itself and took the shape of a massive set of jaws, nearly 8 feet across and lined with 2 rows of dozens of razor-like teeth. Exploding into paper, Conan dodged the whore's next attempt to bite her as the teeth snapped through the space in which she had just stood. Reforming a few yards away, Conan looked between the jaws, turning to face her again, and Gaara, now crouched and glowing with blue light as chakra rolling off his form whipped his red hair and cloak around in several directions at once. The jaws glowed red as they attacked again, this time clipping off the seam of Conan's cloak. She rolled out of the way only a second before they would have killed her. What a technique, Conan said, looking as all around Gaara more shapes in the sand, all similar to the wicked jaws before her, rose into the air and poised themselves to bite. She made a move to jump, knowing she needed to move before the next strike but her feet stuck fast in the sand that had pulled all around her. Oh no, she muttered, realizing too late that Gaara had been corralling her towards his trap. The sand rushed up to her knees, and Conan felt it drain all of her remaining chakra. Goodbye, muttered the Kazekage, his voice animalistic as his porcelain-whitened pupil-less eyes locked on her. Conan screamed briefly just as the red jaws snapped down over her, shearing her in two before biting again and again, gnashing her into a bloody pulp that slopped to the ground beneath the jaws. Sakura turned away from the sight and even Kakuzu gave his teammate's demise a glance out of the corner of his eye before refocusing on his fight with Shirai and Kurena. Trina toned, sticking the tip of her tongue between her teeth. Gross. Gaara stood up on his cloud and exhaled as pupils reopened in his eyes. He didn't seem to care as the floating jaws all around him dissolved into sand and fell back to the ground. He looked between Sakura and the second fight, taking a moment to center himself. Kakuzu was far enough away that any attack the Kazekage directed at him would be predictable by the time it arrived anyway. Way to go, Gaara, Sakura shouted, her head still spinning a little from Kakuzu's poison. We knew you could do it. Gaara turned back to Sakura and the kunoichi thought she caught a hint of a grin flit across his face. The look disappeared though and Gaara's eyes went wide. He grunted and doubled over, clutching his stomach and falling to the ground as his cloud of sand dissolved around him. Trina, Sakura hot behind her, were at the Kazekage's side in a flash, though the exertion made Sakura dizzy. Gaara, what's wrong? Shouted Trina as Gaara's eyes began to glaze over. Sakura steezed herself as best she could and pressed her hands against Gaara's chest as the Kazekage wheezed once and spat up a little blood. His heart's not beating, said Sakura, spinning open Gaara's shirt as her hands began to glow green. We've got to get him slay. What's happening? Asked Karena as she moved to get Gaara into a more static position. Chakra exertion. Sakura shook her head as she pressed her glowing hands to Gaara's chest. The man's face began to flush and his breathing stopped. He's too strong for that. It doesn't matter. We've got to get his heart beating. Overlooking the battle, Ino twitched and then froze. She nearly toppled from the tower and surely would have if Shikamaru hadn't seen her swoon forward and rushed forward to catch her. What's wrong? Asked the Nara as he helped Ino to her feet again. What is it? Ino, breaking into a cold sweat, caught her breath and pointed to where Sakura and Karena were trying to help AS Gaara. Something happened, she said. I felt a spirit, a very, very, very evil one attack Gaara-sama. Ino gasped as another cold bolt rocketed through her and dropped her to her knees. Again, she muttered, as beneath Gaara jerked once, vomiting up a fountain of blood before collapsing. There, Ino said, shifting forward and supporting herself on one hand and her knees. She pointed into the midst of the Crane army. How did I miss it? It's inhuman. It's pure evil, monstrous. What is going on? Shikamaru asked, scanning the crowd beneath him outside Iwa's wall. I don't see what you're talking about. The man with the white hair, said Ino, shaking, thrusting her finger again for emphasis. The one hurting himself. Shikamaru gave the crowd another once-over and looked harder where Ino was pointing, this time registering what was going on. What's he doing? Asked the Nara, watching as a man in the midst of the troops and surrounded by 5 big guards slumped, knelt on the ground in the circle of an odd ritual circle drawn in the dirt. The man had a knife protruding from his stomach and was in the process of driving a short sword in between his ribs. He's invoking one of the old gods, said Ino hurriedly as she got to her feet. There's no time to explain. We've just got to keep him from hurting himself or Gaara and whoever else he's cursed will less. Shikamaru nodded and then quickly asked if Ino was good to fight. The kunoichi ignored the question and the two leapt out of the tower and, with the aid of a genjutsu, disappeared into the crowd. Ahead of the two ninja, hidden on his knees, chanted under his breath in the circle as he slowly moved a knife up to his own tea. His white hair was glimmering in the morning sun and the light glinted also off the blood spinning down the hands of the two blades already sunken in his form. His chanting became more audible as the words, some language long s, came faster and faster while the blade moved simultaneously up to his tea. Behind him, stuck points first in the earth, was a long, multi-bladed scythe made of a black metal. Eyes flying open, Hidden slashed the knife at his tea. The edge pressed against his skin, drawing a thin red line, but sticking fast before any significant damage could be done. The man's face contorted into some combination of surprise and vexation as his eyes traced the thin blue line connecting his chest to the hands of a platinum blonde, ghostly pale young woman standing motionless in the crowd. A Yamanaka? Hidden asked, not bothering to look around at his bodyguards. He saw out of his petrol vision that all of them either were, or soon would be the shadows running up the boss and wrapped tightly around their trip effective strangled them while at the same time holding them in a fairly inconspicuous position. The army troops surrounding the encounter all began to back away, knowing that for any one of them to face a ninja without the battle already being won would be nothing short of asking to be killed. Soon a large empty circle 20 meters across had cleared around the three ninja. Shikamaru, glaring at Hidden with his one eye, released the bodyguards who fell to the ground without so much as a single choke or gag. They'd all been too long. You two know each other? Asked Shikamaru. Know of, said Ino, not letting her concentration waver. A long time back, before my family joined Konoha, my clan fought with an old coven of devil worshippers for powers over the human spirit. Hidden smirked but remained otherwise still. You must be Shingozi's descendant, he said, watching Ino flinch at the mention of her great-grandmother's name. You look just like the old crone and your spirit feels like hers. Hidden grunted and stood up, shattering the line connecting him with Ino and eliciting a yelp from Ino as the psychic pain slapped into her head. I think King you will be enjoyable. He turned around and grabbed the scythe by its handle as Shikamaru glanced between the Akatsuki ninja and Ino. Oh, and I should probably tell you, said Hidden, as if a thought had just struck him. I've set up an extremely intricate series of seals and wards around this circle. If you try to force me out of the ritual circle, the jutsu will instantly hit me with enough raw chakra to KO any living person. Your friend will S immediately if he hasn't already given up his ghost to Jashin. OS, Ino muttered. Jashin was the worst of the old gods. Hiden's smirk widened. Full marks for the good girl who's done her homework. He sneered. You should probably get on with it though. He poised the knife at his tea. I've got nothing but time, and as long as I'm in this circle. Shikamaru slapped his hands together into a seal and his shadow bolted forwards at Hiden. The Akatsuki nin saw the movement and plunged the knife at his heart. The blade again broke the skin but stuck just long enough in his sternum for Shikamaru's jutsu to coil around Hiden's feet and freeze him. Now Shikamaru smirked as the length of pitch shadow coiled up Hiden's, around his torso, and over his arms. Bothersome, muttered Hiden, light glinting off the side's black edges as the weapon hung useless. Try getting out of my endless asylum, Shikamaru said, grinning as an edge of mocking bile crept into his voice. Ino, can you cancel out the ritual so I end this? The kunoiki nodded. The circle is etched in an old chakra, but I think I can manage if you give me a few seconds. Ino glanced at Hiden. Shut him up, she screamed, terror streaking across her face. Hiden had closed his eyes and begun chanting again, chakra lacing his words as his lips moved and his voice wove low, barely audible sounds. Shikamaru swore, understanding only that he needed to move quickly. The shadows raced towards Hiden's mouth, but too late. The last word of the invocation left his lips and the air filled with a sinister howling. A freezing wind came out of the east, so strong that it nearly blew Ino and Shikamaru off their feet. Hiden's cloak whipped around him and shredded in the wind, flying into scraps and pieces that passed through the absolutely motionless members of the Crane army all around. This is bad, Ino whispered. All around herself and Shikamaru a thick fog came from nothing and hung around their knees as Hiden disappeared. Very bad. The two ninjas stood in the exactly where they had before, though the world had taken on a completely different timbre. The sky was grey fog hung in the air, and the sun, although there was still something akin to daylight in the air, was nowhere to be found. The Crane army all around was frozen solid, unmoving, and the smoke billowing up from it were hung like a wispy column of stone in the air. What the hell is going on? Shikamaru asked, walking up to one of the soldiers in the red and black armor. He reached out to poke the man, but his hand passed through as though the soldier was a poorly made buncheon. Ino sat and sighed, her face melancholy as she pulled her knees up to her chest. I'm not sure exactly what, she said. But I know enough about the old clans to know that we've lost. This is a world between worlds. We're not in hell, but we're not in our world either. This is where the old gods live, and until that ninja comes to deal with us, we're stuck here. What? Shikamaru hissed. What do you mean, stuck here? We're trapped here, I think, said Ino. My grandmother never taught me everything about the old coven because we thought they were extinct, but she did say that they could call on the gods to trap the coven's enemies in temporary worlds. Temporary worlds? Asked Shikamaru, his voice calming a bit. Again, Ino said, I don't know how it works, but the god, Jashin in this case, will only hold us here for so long before he makes that ninja come back to deal with us. Until then though, he's free to do whatever he wants. Like King Gaara, and whoever else he wants to offer as as to his god. Shikamaru paused and exhaled like the master chessman who had been defeated by a rarely used rule. So why doesn't the god just KO us himself? Hell if I know, Ino muttered. SC. 10 minutes, said Hiden, seemingly speaking to the thin air. I need only 10 minutes to finish here. He paused and waited for a response. Hearing one, he grimaced. 7 it is then, master. I'll miss one soul, but all the others will still be yours. Hiden opened a concealed pouch at his side and removed a tiny vial of blood, already half empty. Around him more bodyguards emerged from the ranks of soldiers and took up positions around him as the battle continued to rage ahead of him. Hiden looked up to guess at the direction things were going, then sprinkled the remaining blood across his side and stepped back into the ritual circle. He could already see that the defensive lines, or the army, each and every one set up along with the attack on Iwa with the purpose of providing cover for his work, were shattering faster than men could be pulled from the battle in the city to reinforce them. No matter, he said, drawing out a long knife and plunging it into his chest without so much as a grunt. The blade sped into his heart and across the battlefield. Gaara screamed once and then went completely still. Sakura's eyes widened and, already glistening with tears, spilled over as a curse escaped her. Hiden grinned when he heard the death cry even over the sound of the battle. He got down on his knees and muttered for a moment, before reaching behind his back again and pulling out another miniature vial of blood. He unscrewed the top and sprinkled the crimson liquid over the sides. Still battling Kakazu, Shirai looked all around her. What is going on? Her mind practically spat the words. Gaara was the Kazekage had simply dropped over, vomited blood everywhere and Now Kakazu was fighting with renewed strength and pushing both her and Karena farther and farther back, each attack landing closer or hitting a little harder than the one before it. I've got to end this now, muttered the bird country's leader and strongest ninja. She signaled for Karena to give her some cover as she bit her thumb and pressed her hands together. She flew through a series of seals and blue energy began crackling around her fingertips. She grinned wickedly and looked at Kakazu. Goodbye, see? Her eyes widened as a spike of numbness jabbed into her chest, straight into her heart. Shirai's face was a mask of shock as the chakra in her hands dissipated with a whimpering crackle of impotence, and the kunoiki fell forward on her face. Karena turned to see what had happened and shouted the fallen woman's name. She whipped around though to dodge yet another vicious series of attacks from Kakazu who pressed his now insurmountable advantage. Back on the front lines, Sasuke grinned as the Crane's forces continued to crumble before his onslaught. Rank after rank of black and red soldiers either fell before slashing swords and jabbing spears, or turned tail and tried to flee backwards into the tight lines behind them, an action that only made Sasuke's attack all the more unstoppable. The Uchiha pressed forward, resorting to more standard means of battle but also hurling the occasional jutsu and fear-inspiring technique into the ranks of his enemies. After the fifth line of the Crane's defenders, third from the last, shattered and run, Sasuke took a moment to breathe and wipe a bloody gash across his forehead which sped blood down into his eye. He turned to size up the battle elsewhere and saw the Wind Daimyo's luck was nearly as good as his own. On all fronts it seemed like victory couldn't be missed. Sasuke turned and readied to attack again, but he saw from the corner of his eye a flash of green. Green sparks, he thought as the battle raged around him. It was the signal a unit was to send up if they were in dire need of aid. Who needs help? Sasuke fell back enough to safely jump atop an unoccupied carriage which had been used by one of the more vain warriors to reach the front lines. Scanning the battlefield he immediately saw what was wrong. To the Crane's flank, where then Claw and Fang had been attacking hardest, a circle of warriors desperately defended one of the army's few Medinen who was crouched over the Fang country's leader. Sasuke cursed to himself, but reasoned that the battle could easily go on without one of the many generals who lead the piecemealed army. What now? He uttered, seeing another flash of green, not far from where the first had shot up. He looked in that direction and saw a scene eerily similar to the first. Another circle of warriors had formed and fought to defend the fallen leader of the Claw country. This time a soldier had gotten down and begun giving the man CPR, ostensibly to no avail. Another green series of sparks drew Sasuke's gaze to the opposing flanks. No way, whispered the Uchiha. Both the Noodle and the Valley country's leaders had fallen, seemingly unwounded. No arrows protruded from their boss, and Sasuke's peerless eye saw no breaks in their armor or bruised wounds on their persons. He pivoted where he stood and looked back to where the other leaders had fallen and saw the same thing. Not a one of them had been wounded in any way at all. What the F is happening? Sasuke swore as cries and cheers went up from the Crane's forces as officers and commanders shouted that the plan was working. What plan? Muttered Sasuke. Poison. What could be doing this? He watched helplessly, happening to be looking in the direction of the Earth Daimyo, as the bald commander doubled over and vomited up more blood than Sasuke would have guessed the man could have in him. Green sparks followed a moment later. Sasuke heard a cry from the front and turned to see what had happened. At this point he wouldn't have been shocked to see a giant monster having risen up from the earth to his army to pieces, and this wasn't far from the truth. A great black monster had come from nowhere, but it was off where Sasuke knew Sakura and the others were fighting. He muttered. Seemingly made of huge black snakes or tentacles, the monstrosity stood larger than most houses and nearly 20 feet across its roughly humanoid chest. Sitting on great legs, it had made several of the men in both armies cry out in fear. With a sigh of exasperation, Sasuke considered running to help the other ninja against the monster, but paused when he saw that it was turning away from the battle and leaving. What the hell, was all he could manage as the great thing pulled itself along too quickly for something so large, heading east, directly away from the fight. He scanned the area it had just vacated and gasped. It had left because there was no one left to fight. Several unmoving boss lay in its wake, all of which Sasuke recognized. Kurena was the first he saw, laying face down in the dirt next to the fallen Gaara. Several paces away Trina was crumpled, and further yet away from the fight Shirai, the Kunoichi and leader of the bird country, lay in a pool of blood. Sakura was nowhere to be seen. Sasuke didn't know what to say. There was no way this could be happening. He looked back at the front lines and saw the crane making a counterattack. The invasion of Iwa had all but ceased, and all of the soldiers who had been fighting on that front rushed in to reinforce the lines fighting the coalition forces. Now, in a complete reversal of the initial stages of the battle, Sasuke's forces were buckling and readying to shatter. I can't let this happen, Sasuke spat, jumping down from atop the carriage and rushing back towards the front. He could only pray that the other ninja were alive and simply beaten. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.